Most people carry a version of the Second World War inside their heads. D-Day, Churchill, the liberation of Paris, Eisenhower planning in London, the Nazi war machine crumbling under the weight of Allied industry and Allied will. It is a story of moral clarity, democracy versus tyranny, and it ends satisfyingly with the right side winning. That version of the war is real. It happened, and it is also, by almost every measurable dimension, territory contested, armies destroyed, lives lost. A footnote to a different war entirely. The one that actually broke Germany. The one that most Westerners have never seriously reckoned with. The Eastern Front of the Second World War. 3 out of every 4 German soldiers killed in the entire war died in the East. The Soviet Union lost more men in a single battle, Kiev, 1941, than the United States lost across every theater of the entire conflict. The front stretched nearly 2,000 miles. It ran for almost exactly 4 years. And when it was over, the country that had won it had spent 27 million of its own people getting there. What kind of war costs that much? What kind of country pays it and survives? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the only questions that matter if you want to understand what the 20th century actually was. August 23, 1939. 2 men who despised everything the other stood for sat down in Moscow and signed a document that would reshape the world. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, and Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's, put their names to a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The public version pledged that neither country would attack the other. The private version, kept secret for more than 50 years, divided Eastern Europe between them like a property settlement. Poland would be split along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. The Baltic states would fall to Moscow. The whole arrangement, in its cold precision, was the agreement of 2 men who believed they were using each other. The world received the news in something close to disbelief. Nazi Germany and Soviet communism were not merely political opposites. They were ideological systems built on mutual annihilation. Hitler had spent years declaring that Bolshevism was the supreme enemy of Western civilization. Stalin had built his entire foreign policy on the premise that fascism was capitalism's final, murderous form, and that these 2 men had shaken hands was not an act of friendship. It was a transaction. Hitler got a free hand in the West. Stalin got time and territory. Both believed the other would eventually have to be destroyed. Neither thought the reckoning would come so soon. What Stalin did with his time reveals everything about the Soviet Union that matters for the war to come. He used it to take. The eastern half of Poland fell under Soviet occupation within weeks of the pact. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were absorbed in 1940, their governments dissolved, and their populations subjected to the apparatus of Stalinist control almost overnight. Bessarabia was taken from Romania. Finland resisted a Soviet invasion and extracted a punishing cost in blood, though it ultimately ceded territory. Thus, by the time Germany turned east in 1941, the Soviet Union had expanded its western border considerably. Stalin believed he had bought himself a buffer. He had bought himself a graveyard. The Soviet Union that faced Germany in June 1941 had been through a decade of deliberate, organized violence imposed upon itself. In the early 1930s, Stalin had forced the collectivization of Soviet agriculture, seizing privately held farms, driving roughly 5 million peasants from their land, and consolidating control over food production under the state. The resistance was real and fierce. The consequences were catastrophic. Famine swept Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Russian South. Millions died. The peasantry that survived entered the 1930s hollowed out, terrified, and stripped of any remaining sense that the state existed to protect them. And they were not wrong. By 1937, Stalin had turned the same instrument inward on the institution he would need most: the Red Army Officer Corps, the men responsible for commanding Soviet forces in any future war, was systematically destroyed. The trigger was a fabricated conspiracy. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most capable military minds in the Soviet Union, was accused of coordinating a German-funded plot inside the army. The confessions were ruthlessly coerced from him and 7 other senior commanders. All were shot on June 11, 1937. Within hours of the executions, the purge widened. What followed over the next 18 months was unlike anything in the history of a modern military. More than half of the Army's general-grade officers were arrested, imprisoned, or killed. And 68 of the 85 members of the People's Commissariat for Defense were shot or died in captivity. The pattern was not random. The purge specifically targeted the most capable officers. Those who had demonstrated competence and independent judgment were more likely to be arrested than those who had not. Stalin was destroying precisely the men he would most need. He did it because he feared them. The effects were immediate and lasting. Unit commanders who had never led more than a platoon were suddenly responsible for divisions. Officers who survived did so partly by learning never to exercise judgment that had not been explicitly authorized from above. The dual command system, in which political commissars shadowed every military officer and could countermand tactical decisions, was reintroduced, ensuring that ideological loyalty sat in the same headquarters as military competence and that neither could function without the other's approval. The Red Army of 1941 was large, extensively equipped, and deeply, structurally afraid. The Winter War against Finland, fought between November 1939 and March 1940, made the damage visible to the world. Finland had a population of just over 3 million people. The Soviet Union had roughly 170 million. The Red Army's initial assault was routed. Soviet commanders sent infantry into forests in column formation against an enemy that knew the terrain and used it brilliantly. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. It took more than 3 months, and the complete reorganization of the Soviet assault before Finland was forced to negotiate. Then the Soviet Union won territorially. Militarily, it had been an embarrassment. Hitler noticed. Finland sharpened a conviction Hitler already held. The Soviet state was vast, but brittle. Its army was enormous, but incompetent. Its political system had hollowed out the one institution capable of defending it. Hitler had been planning an Eastern campaign since before the war in the West began. The conquest of Soviet territory was not a contingency, but an ideological imperative, the core ambition of his entire political life. Lebensraum, living space in the East, seized from the Slavic peoples he considered subhuman, worked by their surviving populations as slave labor in service of a German civilization that would endure 1,000 years. This was not a military objective. It was a fantasy of annihilation dressed in geopolitical language. The planning for the invasion began in earnest in the summer of 1940, even as German bombers were still crossing the Channel toward Britain. The directive came on December 18, 1940. Operation Barbarossa, named for the medieval German emperor who had drowned on crusade. 3 army groups, 3 axes of advance, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south toward Kiev and the Ukrainian grain fields. The operational concept was the same that had shattered France in 6 weeks. Concentrated armor punching through the front, encircling Soviet forces before they could withdraw, destroying them in vast pockets while the infantry caught up. It had worked everywhere they had tried it. There was no reason in German planning assumptions to believe the Soviet Union would be different. Stalin received intelligence of the coming attack from dozens of sources. British intelligence passed him intercepts. His own agents inside Germany sent detailed warnings. Soviet border guards in the final weeks before the invasion reported German troops massing in numbers that made the purpose unmistakable. On June 21, 1941, the day before the attack, a German soldier deserted across the Soviet lines and told his captors the invasion would begin at dawn. Stalin's response, relayed to his commanders, was that the deserter should be shot for spreading disinformation. He had convinced himself that Hitler would not strike while Britain remained undefeated. He had convinced himself that warnings were provocations. He had, in a very precise sense, constructed a mental world in which the attack could not happen. And then he stayed inside it. The men who knew better could not say so. Georgy Zhukov, the chief of the General Staff, had spent months arguing for greater defensive preparation along the western border. He was ignored. Semyon Timoshenko, the defense commissar, stayed awake through the night of June 21st, waiting. At 3:30 in the morning on June 22, 1941, reports of heavy shelling began arriving from the frontier. Timoshenko and Zhukov drove immediately to the Kremlin to wake Stalin. When they reached him, he would not immediately accept what they were telling him. The largest military invasion in human history had already begun, and the man at the center of the Soviet state was asking whether it might still be a provocation. The Soviet Union on the morning of June 22nd. In 1941 was a country that had spent the previous decade being remade through coercion. Its agriculture had been collectivized at a cost of millions of lives. Its army had been decapitated. Its population had been subjected to waves of terror that had made informing on neighbors, confessing to crimes never committed, and surviving through silent compliance the basic habits of daily life. And yet it had also been transformed industrially. Steel production had multiplied. Cities had been built from nothing in the Urals and beyond. The command economy, whatever its human cost, had done what it was designed to do: concentrate resources at speed in directions the state chose. The question the war would answer was whether that transformation had been enough, and what it would cost to find out. Across the border, 3 army groups were finalizing their last preparations in the pre-dawn dark. Army Group North would drive from East Prussia toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, would push through Belorussia toward Smolensk and then Moscow. Army Group South would advance into Ukraine. Altogether, more than 3 million German soldiers were in position along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. They were joined by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian forces, making it the largest coalition army ever assembled. Almost none of them expected to still be fighting the following winter. Most expected to be home by autumn. The officers planning the campaign had named it after an emperor who died before reaching his destination. No one appears to have considered the omen. Stalin spent the days immediately following the invasion in a state that those around him later described as collapse. For nearly a week, from June 23rd to June 30th, he issued no orders and signed no documents. He had retreated to his dacha outside Moscow. Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, and other members of the inner circle drove out to find him. By some accounts, Stalin believed they had come to arrest him. He had, in the manner of a man who had built a system on absolute personal authority, constructed a state that could not function when he stopped functioning. The armies being destroyed along the frontier were waiting for orders that were not coming. What broke the paralysis is not entirely certain. What is certain is that Stalin returned to Moscow on June 30th. He reconstituted the State Defense Committee with himself at its head and began the work of fighting the war his miscalculation had made catastrophic. He would chair the committee for the next 4 years. He would sleep in the Kremlin. He would drive his generals, his factory directors, and his general subordinates with a combination of terror and pragmatism that few men in history have matched. The man who had spent a decade destroying the institutions around him now had to rebuild them in the middle of the worst military catastrophe in Russian history, with the enemy already 200 miles inside his borders. The world before Barbarossa was a world of 2 men calculating, and one of them calculating badly. Stalin had spent 12 years building a state that ran on fear. Fear of the purge, fear of the commissar, fear of the informer, fear of the knock on the door in the night. He had built it that way because he believed it was the only kind of state that could survive in a world of enemies. What June 22, 1941 revealed was that he was right about the enemies and catastrophically wrong about everything else. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 22, 1941, more than 7,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. Then the tanks moved. 3 army groups, north, center, south, crossed into Soviet territory in the darkness before dawn, carrying with them the largest single military force ever assembled in the history of warfare. Nearly 3.5 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian formations. More than 3,000 tanks, 2,700 aircraft. The men in those formations had shattered Poland in 3 weeks, France in 6. Most of them expected to be home before the first snow. You are a Soviet border guard at a crossing point in Belorussia. You are 22 years old. You have been in your position since before midnight because something has been wrong all week. The usual radio traffic from the German side of the border has gone silent. Then, at 3:15 in the morning, the sky turns orange. The sound arrives a second later, a roar so encompassing it has no direction, only pressure. The telephone lines go dead within minutes. The officer you would normally report to has already been killed by a bomb that found his command post before he finished his first cup of coffee. You have no orders because there is no one left to give them. The Soviet Air Force on the western frontier ceased to exist in the first hours. German aircraft flew in low and destroyed planes while they sat parked on the ground in neat rows, easy targets for pilots who had been doing this since Spain, since Poland, since the flat airfields of France. More than 1,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the first day of the war, most of them before they could get airborne. By the end of the first week, the Red Air Force along the front had lost somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 planes. With the skies cleared, German armored columns could drive deep and fast with no fear of anything attacking them from above. Army Group Center executed precisely the maneuver its planners had designed. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck south of the Pripyat marshes, while General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group drove north of them. The two armored fists moved fast, not toward the Soviet infantry in front of them, but around it, curving inward to meet behind it. By June 28th, 6 days into the war, the pincers closed west of Minsk. Inside the pocket were 3 Soviet armies. The city of Minsk, capital of Belorussia, had already fallen. The Western Front, the entire Soviet force defending the central axis toward Moscow, had effectively ceased to exist. More than 300,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner in the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. German losses for the same operation were counted in the tens of thousands. The ratio was almost incomprehensible by the standards of modern warfare. Soviet units that had not been encircled tried to counterattack and were destroyed in the open. Units that survived the first contact fell back in disorder, their communications severed, their commanders dead or missing, their flanks collapsed. The Red Army had trained for an aggressive forward defense, meeting a German attack with an immediate counteroffensive into German-occupied Poland. The attack came before the doctrine could be applied, and the doctrine fell apart almost immediately anyway. The German method was not new, but it had never been applied at this scale. Then Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was less a technology than a philosophy. Speed over mass, disruption over attrition, psychological collapse over physical annihilation. The point was not to kill every enemy soldier. It was to move so fast that enemy units lost the ability to understand what was happening to them. A commander who does not know where his flanks are cannot give useful orders. A soldier who does not know where his unit is cannot fight effectively. The German advance in the summer of 1941 routinely produced precisely this condition. Entire Soviet formations turning to find German armor already behind them, their line of retreat already cut. their choices already gone. The scale of the destruction in the opening weeks forced a fact into the open that Soviet planners had tried not to confront. The Red Army had more than 20,000 tanks at the start of the war, a number that dwarfed German armored strength. But having tanks and being able to use them are different propositions. Soviet tank crews were poorly trained, their vehicles often poorly maintained, and their radios frequently absent or broken. Armored units were ordered forward without infantry support, without artillery coordination, without air cover. They were slaughtered by German anti-tank guns and aircraft almost as efficiently as the infantry had been. Hitler would later tell his generals that if he had known the actual size of Soviet tank strength in 1941, he might not have attacked. He had attacked anyway, and it had not mattered. Army Group North drove from East Prussia through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. And the Baltic countries had been under Soviet control for less than a year. Their populations in some places greeted the German advance not as conquest, but as liberation, at least initially. Some Lithuanian and Latvian formations actively cooperated with the German advance. The response of the retreating Soviet administration was immediate and brutal. Lists of suspected enemies were executed before the withdrawal. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia each exchanged one occupation for another within weeks. The difference in what each occupation meant would not become fully apparent until later. In the summer of 1941, the German columns moved too fast for most people to think clearly about it. By the third week of July, Army Group Center had reached Smolensk, less than 250 miles from Moscow. The speed was extraordinary. Napoleon had taken weeks to cover the same ground in 1812, but the German high command was already arguing about what to do next. Hitler's instinct was to divert the central thrust, pull armored strength from the drive toward Moscow, and redirect it north to seal Leningrad's fate, and south to complete the encirclement of Soviet forces in Ukraine. His generals, almost uniformly, believed Moscow was the decisive objective and that everything should concentrate there. The argument consumed weeks. Hitler won it. Army Group Center's armored spearheads turned south. The consequences were enormous. Guderian's tanks drove south and east in a great arc, linking with armored forces pushing north from Army Group South. The pincers met east of Kiev on September 16, 1941, closing around the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. And inside the pocket were 5 Soviet armies, more than 450,000 soldiers, along with their equipment, their command staffs, and the entire defensive structure the Soviet Union had built in Ukraine. The southwestern front had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Kiev fell on September 19th. The victory was total, and it was too large, and it had consumed time the German army could not afford. Among the Soviet soldiers taken prisoner at Kiev was almost certainly a young man from a village in central Ukraine who had been conscripted in the first weeks of the war and had not yet seen his family again. He had marched. He had dug positions. He had been ordered forward and then back and then forward again, with explanations that came rarely and made little sense. Now he sat in a field with hundreds of thousands of others, guarded by German soldiers who had not been given instructions for managing prisoners at this scale because no one had believed there would be prisoners at this scale. The Germans had planned for a campaign of weeks. They had no infrastructure for the administration of empires of captives. The men in that field were about to learn what that meant. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war in 1941 was not incidental cruelty. It was policy. The Nazi regime had classified the war in the East as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation, against a population it considered racially and ideologically subhuman. Soviet prisoners were not protected under the Geneva Convention because the Soviet Union had not signed it in a form Germany recognized. German quartermaster calculations simply did not provide food rations for Soviet captives at a level compatible with survival. Of the approximately 3.3 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner in 1941 alone, more than 2 million were dead by the following spring, from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate execution. This was not the fog of war. It was its design. Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, was launched on October 2, 1941. It opened with another enormous encirclement, this time around Bryansk and Vyazma, trapping a further 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow appeared open. Panzer commanders drove their lead elements until the engines burned out. Infantry marched through the night, and then, in mid-October, the rain came. The Russian autumn had a name for what happened to unpaved roads in the rain: Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Wheels sank to their axles, horses drowned in the mire. Tracked vehicles kept moving, but the horse-drawn supply wagons that followed them did not. The German advance slowed from a rush to a crawl, then stopped. The German army that had crossed into the Soviet Union in June had been designed and equipped for a summer campaign of 3 to 4 months. It had no winter clothing because its planners had not believed winter clothing would be needed. Soldiers who had sweated through August in shirt sleeves now watched the temperature fall below, freezing with greatcoats that stopped at the knee. Engine oil solidified, rifle mechanisms froze. Severe frostbite began permanently crippling men who were still expected to attack. German casualties by the end of November 1941 stood at more than 700,000, dead, wounded, or missing. All of the Army's trained reserves had been consumed. There were no replacements in the system. On the Soviet side of the line, something was happening that German intelligence had failed to anticipate and continued to struggle to believe. The Red Army was not running out of men. Every encirclement destroyed one Soviet force and another appeared behind it. Siberian divisions, held in reserve for a possible Japanese attack that had not come, were released and began moving west by rail. Civilians in Moscow dug anti-tank ditches around the city perimeter in the October cold. The Soviet government had evacuated eastward. Leningrad was already under siege, and its land connection to the rest of the country severed. But the state had not collapsed. The apparatus of coercion and mobilization that Stalin had built kept functioning even as the front lines fell back hundreds of miles. By mid-November, with the ground frozen solid again, the Germans attempted one final push. The northern pincer of the Moscow offensive got within 12 miles of the city, close enough that soldiers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses. Whether that is precisely true is uncertain. What is certain is that they got no closer. The German forces at the tip of that advance had outrun their supply lines by hundreds of miles. They were cold, exhausted, and operating in strength fractions of what they had started the campaign with. They stopped not because they chose to, but because they could not physically continue. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a major counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers attacked along a line stretching hundreds of miles. The Germans, fixed in place by cold and supply failure, were driven back, not routed, not destroyed, but pushed away from Moscow in fighting that was desperate and expensive on both sides. For the first time in the war, a German army had been forced into strategic retreat. Hitler's response was to sack the commanders he blamed, Brauchitsch, Bach, Guderian, and others, and assume personal command of the army himself. He issued a standing order: no retreats. Units would hold their ground or face court-martial. Some did. Some were destroyed where they stood. The Barbarossa had failed to deliver the victory it had been designed for. The Soviet state had not collapsed. The Red Army had not been destroyed. The German army had occupied an enormous and economically vital portion of Soviet territory: Ukraine, most of Belorussia, the approaches to Leningrad, the western suburbs of Moscow, and had killed or captured millions of Soviet soldiers. By almost any historical standard, it was a campaign of stunning military achievement. It had also set in motion a war of attrition that Germany on its own could not win. The largest invasion in history had produced not a decision, but a condition. And the condition was that two systems, one built on professional military excellence and the other built on mass and coercion, would now grind against each other until one of them gave way. And every army in the Second World War drew on the state behind it. The Wehrmacht drew on German engineering, German organization, and the accumulated military culture of Prussia. The British Army drew on the Empire, on the industrial Midlands, on a professional NCO corps built over centuries. The American Army drew on an economy so vast that abundance itself became a military factor. The Red Army drew on something different, a state that had spent 15 years learning how to extract from its population whatever the state decided it needed, regardless of what the population thought about it. That system was brutal, inefficient, often savage in its waste of human life. It was also, in the specific and terrible circumstances of 1941 to 1945, exactly what the situation required. The architecture of the Soviet war machine was established not in June 1941, but in 1928, when Stalin launched the first 5-year plan. The plan's purpose was transformation. Turn a predominantly agricultural country into an industrial power within a decade through central direction, state ownership, and coercion on a scale no government had previously attempted in peacetime. Steel production targets were set in Moscow and relayed down through a hierarchy of commissariats and regional administrations and factory directors, each of whom understood that failure to meet the quota was not a managerial problem, but a criminal one. Fear drove production. Fear drove construction. Fear built the tank factories in the Urals that would outlast the Wehrmacht. By the time war came, Soviet heavy industry had been remade almost beyond recognition. The steel output had grown roughly 5-fold since 1928. Coal production had more than doubled. The Soviet Union had built tractor factories in Stalingrad and Kharkov that could be, and were, converted to produce tanks. It had built metallurgical plants in the Urals and beyond the reach of any conceivable German advance. The transformation had come at an enormous cost in human suffering, in famine deaths, in gulag labor, in the systematic destruction of the peasant way of life across 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The factories existed because the people who built them had no choice. On June 30th, 1941, 8 days after the invasion began, Stalin reconstituted the government of the Soviet Union as a war cabinet called the State Defense Committee, the GKO. It had 5 original members. Stalin chaired it. Its decrees had the force of law over every institution in the country: army, party, police, industry, agriculture, transport. Over the course of the war, the GKO would issue more than 9,000 such decrees, each one bypassing peacetime bureaucracy and moving directly to the point. How many shells, how many aircraft, how many men, by what date, from where? The Soviet state had always been centralized. The GKO made it total. You are a factory director in the Urals in the winter of 1942. You have received a directive from Moscow specifying your monthly output of artillery shells. The number on the directive is not a suggestion. If you meet it, you keep your position and perhaps receive a food allocation above the standard ration. If you fall short, the NKVD officer assigned to your facility files a report. Reports of that kind led to arrests, and arrests led to places from which people did not return. You do not think of your workers as employees. You think of them as a resource to be managed at maximum intensity, because your survival depends on the output they produce. You push them accordingly. They work 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. Some of them die. Production continues. Within the Red Army itself, ideology was not a decoration applied over military function. It was load-bearing. Every regiment contained political officers, commissars, whose authority ran parallel to the commanding officers. The commissar monitored morale, reported on political reliability, conducted propaganda sessions in the gaps between fighting and had the power to countermand tactical decisions they judged to be motivated by cowardice or ideological failure rather than military necessity. In 1941, the dual command system frequently produced paralysis. Officers afraid to make decisions without commissar co-signature, commissars making military calls they were unqualified to make. The system was reformed in 1942 when it became clear that it was costing more lives than it was saving. The commissars remained, but their veto over operational decisions was removed. Alongside the commissar system ran the NKVD's security apparatus within the army. Smrtspionam, death to spies, was the counterintelligence organization responsible for identifying deserters, saboteurs, traitors, and men who had retreated without orders. Its officers were embedded throughout every fighting formation. A soldier who fell back without authorization risked being picked up by Smrsh rather than his own unit. The line between retreat under pressure and unauthorized withdrawal was rarely clear on a front collapsing in multiple directions simultaneously, and Smrsh was not designed to draw fine distinctions. Fear of the enemy and fear of one's own security apparatus occupied the same space inside a Soviet soldier's mind, pressing in from opposite directions. Order 227 made this institutional logic explicit. Issued on July 28, 1942, as German forces were driving deep into southern Russia toward Stalingrad, the order carried a three-word slogan that became the defining phrase of the Soviet war: Ni shagu nazad, not a step back. Every front was required to create penal battalions of up to 800 men, drawn from officers and soldiers convicted of disciplinary failures, cowardice, or unsanctioned retreat. The penal battalions were assigned to the most dangerous sections of the front, the positions where survival rates were lowest, the attacks that amounted to orders to advance into fire without hope of cover. A man in a penal battalion atoned for his crimes, as the order put it, with his life. Behind the penal battalions were the blocking detachments, units of regular soldiers positioned in the rear with orders to stop any unauthorized retreat by force. In the first 3 months of the order's operation, blocking detachments shot approximately 1,000 soldiers and sent nearly 25,000 more to penal units. The total number of Red Army soldiers executed by their own army's authority across the entire war reached approximately 158,000. That figure exceeds the total British military deaths at the Battle of the Somme. The Soviet state treated its own army the same way it treated its economy, as a resource to be driven until it produced the required output with lethal consequences for failure. For a Red Army soldier, the calculus of existence was stark and unusual. He understood, not from ideology but from direct observation, that dying in combat was one possible outcome, and dying at the hands of his own side was another. Between those two possibilities lay a narrow corridor of survival that required advancing when ordered, holding when ordered, and under no circumstances moving without orders. This was not courage in the conventional sense. It was a specific kind of obedience produced by a specific kind of fear. The distinction matters because it shaped everything about how the Red Army fought. Its tactical inflexibility in the early years, its tendency to accept casualties that would have broken any Western formation, its willingness to repeat attacks that had already failed, and yet the system was not only coercion. That account is incomplete, and incompleteness here is its own form of distortion. Soviet soldiers also fought because they believed. Because the war touched something real in them that ideology had planted, but that the burning of their villages and the destruction of their families had turned into something beyond the reach of any commissar to manufacture. The Nazi invasion was genocidal in its intent and visible in its conduct. Villages were burned, prisoners were starved. The Jewish populations of occupied Soviet towns were systematically eradicated in ravines or forests within days of the German arrival. A Soviet soldier who had passed through occupied territory or received a letter from home understood, with clarity that required no political instruction, what defeat meant for everyone he had ever known. The Gulag, the vast network of forced labor camps that had grown throughout the 1930s, did not suspend operations when the war began. It adapted. By 1941, the camp population stood at approximately 2.3 million people. Those inmates sewed uniforms, assembled artillery shells, felled timber, mined coal and gold, and built the infrastructure through which the war economy ran. More than 1 million Gulag prisoners died in the camps between 1941 and 1945, worked to exhaustion in conditions that worsened as the war's demands on the broader economy increased. Some inmates were released early and sent directly to the front, roughly 157,000 in 1942 and 1943 alone, to fill the gaps left by the losses of the previous year's catastrophes. The camp was not separate from the war. It was part of the machine. Women entered the war economy at a scale that transformed Soviet industry's gender composition almost overnight. By 1943, women made up more than half the workforce in many industrial sectors. They operated lathes and cranes and blast furnaces. They drove tractors on collective farms that no longer had men to work them. More than 800,000 Soviet women served in the military directly, as snipers, as anti-aircraft gunners, as pilots, as medics and nurses, in conditions that bore no resemblance to the medical arrangements of Western armies. The integration was not progressive in its motivation. It was necessity, driven by the rate at which men were being killed and the absolute requirement that production not stop regardless. The food system illustrated the hierarchy of the war machine with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Soldiers at the front received rations calibrated to their function: heavy physical labor, exposure to cold, the caloric demands of combat. Factory workers received rations calculated to keep them producing at the rate required. Civilians in cities received less. Peasants on collective farms received what remained after the state's procurement quotas had been met, which in some regions in some years was almost nothing. The famine that followed German occupation of Ukraine and the destruction of supply lines killed millions of Soviet civilians during the war years. The state's procurement apparatus continued extracting grain from unoccupied agricultural regions regardless. The priority ordering was unambiguous: the machine first, the people second. Stalin himself was the single point through which every major decision passed. He chaired the GKO. He chaired the Stavka, the military high command. He served as People's Commissar of Defense. He approved production targets, signed death warrants, reviewed frontline dispositions, and conducted telephone calls with army commanders in the middle of the night that those commanders feared above almost anything the Germans could do to them. And the terror that had characterized the pre-war years did not disappear. It became operational. Officers who failed in battle were arrested. Generals who retreated without permission were shot. The possibility of punishment was not a background condition of Soviet military service. It was an active management tool, applied continuously. What made the system function, and this is the fact most difficult to hold alongside everything else, was that it worked, not elegantly, not without catastrophic waste, not without inflicting on the Soviet people a level of suffering that should have broken any society that retained the option of breaking. But the tanks kept coming, the shells kept arriving, the divisions kept forming up in the rear as the divisions in front of them were destroyed. Now, the Germans had planned for a Soviet Union that would collapse under pressure. They had planned for an army that would dissolve when its command structure was severed and its losses became unsustainable. What they got instead was a system specifically engineered to function under those conditions, because the conditions of total war were not so different in their essential demand structure from the conditions of total peace that the Soviet state had already imposed on itself for 15 years. The German soldier in 1941 was, by most measures, the better individual fighter. Better trained, more experienced, operating within a military culture that rewarded initiative and trusted the judgment of men at the point of contact. His Soviet counterpart was often undertrained, often poorly equipped, operating within a system that punished individual judgment and rewarded compliance. In a contest of tactical excellence, the German army won repeatedly. That contest was not, however, the contest that decided the war. The contest that decided the war was a question of which system could absorb destruction at a greater rate and continue producing combat power. And that was a question the Soviet state had been preparing to answer, without knowing it, since 1928. There is a specific kind of horror in a war machine that turns its own people into fuel. The Soviet state did not experience its citizens as ends in themselves. It experienced them as inputs, labor inputs, military inputs, agricultural inputs, whose proper function was to serve the output the state required. That view of human beings is morally catastrophic. It is also, in the arithmetic of the Eastern Front, what made the difference. The West has never had to reckon fully with that fact. To do so requires holding two things simultaneously: that the Soviet Union's victory was genuine and necessary, and that the methods which produced it were a form of violence against the people it claimed to be defending. You are a woman in Chelyabinsk in the winter of 1943. You are 31 years old. Your husband died at Kiev. You work 12 hours a day in a tank factory that was a tractor factory 18 months ago. You are cold. Your rations are not enough. There is no one to watch your children during your shift, so they wait in the corridor on a bench with a blanket. You do not think of yourself as heroic. You think of yourself as someone who has no choice. You are correct on both counts. The tank you are helping build will be driven by someone younger than your husband was, toward a front line that neither of you will ever see. It will probably be destroyed within weeks of leaving the factory. Another one will follow it. This is how the war was won. The Soviet state as weapon was not a thing the Soviet people chose. It was a thing done to them and through them simultaneously, a system of coercion so complete that the line between sacrifice and compulsion became impossible to find. The men who fought, the women who built, the prisoners who mined and sewed and hammered, all of them were moving in the same direction, under the same pressure, toward the same end. That they moved at all, under conditions that would have immobilized any freer society, is the central fact of the Eastern Front. Everything else, the battles, notice the turning points, the generals, the tank designs, is commentary on that fact. The numbers from the first 18 months of the Eastern Front do not behave like numbers. They are too large to process as facts and too specific to dismiss as abstractions. In the single encirclement at Kiev in September 1941, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, captured, or went missing. More than at any other encirclement in the history of warfare, including the ones that had already happened that summer. The entire southwestern front was destroyed and had to be reconstituted from scratch. The German Army's Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, had written in his diary 2 months earlier that the Soviet Union was essentially beaten. He wrote that on July 3, 1941, 11 days after the invasion began. He was wrong by nearly 4 years. Yet the experience of a Soviet soldier in the summer and autumn of 1941 was defined by a specific, unrelenting condition, having no idea what was happening. Communication systems collapsed in the first hours of the invasion. Units lost contact with their flanks before they could determine where their flanks were. Orders arrived describing defensive lines that had already been overrun, or counterattacks against formations that had already encircled the men being ordered to attack them. Officers who requested permission to retreat were sometimes shot by commissars before the retreat could be authorized. Officers who retreated without requesting permission were shot after. The tactical situation was almost always desperate. The administrative response to desperation was almost always punitive. Men died in both directions. Minsk, yet the capital of Belorussia, fell to the Germans on June 28, 6 days after the invasion began. Smolensk, 300 miles deeper into Soviet territory, fell in late July. The cities burned as the German formations swept through them. The populations that remained faced a German occupying authority that had arrived with explicit racial categories, determining who lived, who was put to work, and who was shot within hours of the troops entering the streets. Soviet Jews in town after town across the occupied Western territories were systematically gathered and eliminated by Einsatzgruppen extermination units that followed the army into every city it took. This was not separate from the war. It was part of the same document, the ideological framework that made the entire Eastern campaign a war of extermination from its first day. The prisoners captured in the great encirclements of the summer and autumn were the largest single category of victims in those months. By February 1942, 8 months into the war, roughly 3.4 million Soviet soldiers had passed into German captivity. 2 million of them were already dead. The death rate in October 1941, at its peak, reached approximately 5,000 Soviet prisoners per day. They died in open fields, surrounded by wire, without shelter, without food, in temperatures that dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius as winter arrived. The official German ration for Soviet prisoners was set at a level their own military scientists knew was insufficient for survival. In practice, prisoners received far less than the official ration. The bread that arrived, when it arrived, was made partly from sawdust and beet husks. Men ate grass and tree bark when they could reach them. In the camps in Belorussia, prisoners dug holes in the earth to sleep in because there was nothing else. The treatment of Soviet prisoners was not an administrative failure or a consequence of the campaign's unexpected scale. It was policy derived from ideology. The Nazi regime had classified the entire Eastern War as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation, before the first soldier crossed the border. Commissar Order, issued in June 1941, instructed German forces to execute political officers on capture. The Hunger Plan, developed by German economic planners in the spring of 1941, envisaged the deliberate starvation of 20 to 30 million Soviet civilians in occupied territories to redirect food production toward Germany. The plan was never fully implemented because the German advance stalled before it could be. The intent, however, was there in the planning files before a single shot was fired. Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, was encircled by German and Finnish forces on September 8, 1941. The siege would last 872 days. Within weeks of the encirclement, the city's land supply lines were severed. Food stocks ran low by October. By November, the daily ration for civilians not engaged in industrial work had fallen to 125 grams of bread, a thick slice, and almost nothing else. Half that bread was not bread. It was compressed sawdust and industrial additives shaped into something the body could not digest. Deaths peaked in January and February of 1942 at roughly 100,000 civilians per month. People died in their apartments, on the streets, in the queues outside food distribution points. Families dragged the bodies of their dead on sledges to collection points because there was no other way to get them there. Inside Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 1942, you ate what you could find. Wallpaper paste was boiled because it contained trace amounts of potato starch. Leather belts and boots were softened over heat and consumed. Zoo animals had been eaten in the autumn, and the city's cats and dogs were gone before winter deepened. The NKVD recorded documented cases of unimaginable desperation, where the boundaries of human endurance collapsed entirely in the search for sustenance. The city's residents were aware of what was happening around them, and most of them continued going to work, continued performing in orchestras, continued doing whatever the state required, because the alternative to continuing was dying slightly faster. The siege of Leningrad claimed an estimated 1 million civilian lives. It remains the deadliest siege in recorded history. The supply line that kept Leningrad alive ran across the surface of Lake Ladoga in winter, trucks driving at intervals across frozen water, spaced far enough apart that if the ice gave way under one vehicle, it would not take the next with it. German aircraft targeted the route. Ice conditions made it treacherous in warm spells and impassable in thaw. But the trucks kept going, and the city kept receiving enough to survive on, barely, incompletely, with continuous attrition through 3 winters until the blockade was finally broken in January 1944. The road across the lake was called the Road of Life by the people who used it. It was the kind of name people give things when the alternative is too absolute to name. The German advance paused in the mud of October 1941 and resumed in mid-November when the ground froze. Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, had opened in October with another enormous encirclement, this one at Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow was open again. German reconnaissance units could see the city's anti-aircraft balloons from their forward positions, and then the advance stopped. The temperature in early December 1941 fell to -30 and below. The German soldiers were wearing summer uniforms because their supply system had not forwarded winter clothing. There was no winter clothing in the supply system because the campaign was supposed to have been over by autumn. The German soldier at the gate of Moscow in December 1941 was a man in a condition his army had not designed for. His weapon mechanisms froze in temperatures they had not been tested for. Engine oil solidified overnight and required open flame to restore viscosity before vehicles could move in the morning. Frostbite worked quietly and quickly, removing extremities from men who needed to hold rifles and pull triggers. Ammunition and fuel had been outpaced by the advance and were insufficient at the front. And the divisions that had swept from the Polish border to the suburbs of Moscow in 5 months were now at a fraction of their starting strength, fighting on momentum that had finally run out. They stopped, not as a military decision, but as a physical reality. On December 5, 1941, Georgy Zhukov launched the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow. 58 reserve divisions attacked along a 600-mile front. Many of the divisions coming from Siberia and the Soviet Far East were equipped and trained for winter warfare. They wore white camouflage over padded uniforms. They moved on skis across ground the German army's wheeled transport could not traverse. The Germans, fixed in place by cold and supply failure and Hitler's standing order forbidding retreat, were driven back, not destroyed, but pushed 15 to 30 miles in the first weeks of the offensive. It was the first time in the war that a German army had been pushed back. At Wehrmacht headquarters, the magnitude of what was happening took days to fully register. The pattern of 1942 repeated the horrors of 1941 at a scale that had become, in the most terrible sense, routine. The Soviet command, overconfident after Moscow, launched a series of offensives in the spring and summer of 1942 that repeated the mistakes of the previous year in reverse. Soviet forces this time were the ones who outran their supply lines, lost cohesion, and were encircled. The Second Shock Army, under General Andrei Vlasov, was surrounded in the forests south of Leningrad and destroyed. Vlasov himself was captured and eventually agreed to lead a German-sponsored Russian liberation force, a choice that cost him his life after the war. The Kharkov offensive in May 1942 ended in another catastrophic encirclement, with more than 200,000 Soviet soldiers lost. The summer of 1942 brought a German offensive on a new axis. Army Group South drove not toward Moscow, but southeast, toward the Don River, toward Stalingrad, toward the Caucasus and its oil fields. The oil of the Caucasus was what Germany needed to sustain mechanized warfare indefinitely. Hitler divided Army Group South into two formations, one driving for the oil fields, one driving for Stalingrad. The division of force was a strategic error. Neither objective received enough strength to take it quickly. But through the summer months, the Wehrmacht drove deep and fast, and Soviet forces fell back in disorder along hundreds of miles of steppe. Stalin's Order 227, not a step back, was issued in this period precisely because the retreating was not stopping on its own. The summer of 1942 was, for the Soviet population living in the path of the German advance, the second experience of occupation in a year. Those who had lived under German occupation since 1941 understood already what it meant. The administration of occupied Soviet territory was built on racial hierarchy, forced labor, and the systematic elimination of designated categories of people. Jewish communities across Ukraine and Belorussia had been almost entirely destroyed by the end of 1941. Hundreds of thousands shot in forests and ravines by Einsatzgruppen and their local collaborators. The broader Slavic population was subjected to forced labor extraction, confiscation of food and property, and at a level of administrative violence that had no parallel in the German occupation of Western Europe. The home front of the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942 was not a place from which the war was experienced at a distance. It was a place where the war arrived in the form of telegrams, in the form of factory directives that doubled and then doubled again the working hours required from people who had not enough to eat, in the form of evacuation orders that sent millions of civilians eastward on trains while German forces advanced westward on the roads beside them. Approximately 17 million Soviet civilians were evacuated from threatened territories between 1941 and 1942. The logistics of moving that many people under fire, with a rail network being bombed and a bureaucracy being run by people who could be shot for failure, this constituted a feat of improvised organization that history has not adequately absorbed. The children left behind, or separated from their families in the chaos of evacuation, inhabited a particular stratum of the war's suffering. Orphanages filled and overflowed. Children in Leningrad learned to identify the sound of artillery by caliber and to distinguish incoming from outgoing fire before they were old enough for mathematics. In occupied territories, children saw what happened to their neighbors and in some cases to their parents within days of the German arrival. The war manufactured a generation whose earliest coherent memories were of profound loss, of relentless hunger, of the specific sound of a column of vehicles entering a town at night. Soviet military losses in 1941 and 1942 were of a scale that should have ended the capacity to resist. By the close of 1941, the Red Army had suffered approximately 4.5 million casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. New formations were raised, trained for weeks rather than months, and sent forward to replace them. By the close of 1942, total Soviet military casualties for the war had reached approximately 11 million. The country continued fighting. It continued producing tanks. It continued calling up men from the interior who had not yet served. The depth of the Soviet Union, its territory, its population, its industrial base relocated beyond the Urals, was functioning as exactly the strategic buffer Stalin had always claimed to be building toward. Nay, through exactly the coercive methods he had used to build it. The 18 months from June 1941 to the end of 1942 constituted the most destructive period in the history of warfare. Not the most decisive, that came later. Not the most strategically sophisticated, that too came later. The most destructive in raw human terms, in the concentrated murder of soldiers and civilians, in the organized starvation of prisoners in cities, in the displacement of tens of millions of people across a front longer than any previous war had produced. The West looks at this period through the lens of North Africa, of the Atlantic convoys, of the planning for eventual invasion. Those were real theaters, real costs, real courage. They were not by any measurement that takes the numbers seriously, The same war. In the summer of 1942, the German army drove southeast across the southern Russian steppe in a campaign called Case Blue. The objective was oil, the fields of the Caucasus that fed the Soviet war economy and which Germany needed to sustain its own. Stalingrad, a city strung along the western bank of the Volga River for 25 miles, was originally a secondary target, worth neutralizing because it controlled rail and river supply routes, but not the strategic heart of the offensive. Hitler changed that calculation as the summer advanced. The city carried Stalin's name. He wanted it. His generals argued against prioritizing it. He overruled them. The decision was not a military one. It was a statement aimed at the man on the other side of the front, and it cost Germany the war in the south. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached Stalingrad in August 1942. The Luftwaffe preceded the ground troops with bombing raids that killed thousands of civilians and reduced most of the city's residential districts to rubble. The destruction was comprehensive and, for the attackers, counterproductive. Rubble fields negated armored mobility. Collapsed buildings created covered firing positions at every level in every direction. A city reduced to wreckage by bombing became more defensible, not less. A fact the German commanders understood too late to matter. By the time Paulus's infantry entered the streets in September, Stalingrad had become the kind of battlefield that negated everything the Wehrmacht did well and amplified everything it struggled with. The defense of the city fell to General Vasily Chuikov and the Soviet 62nd Army. Chuikov was 42 years old, physically tough, and clear-eyed about what his mission required. He kept his headquarters within 500 yards of German positions, close enough that his own staff could hear the fighting from the dugout. His tactical doctrine was built on a single principle: stay as close to the German line as possible. If Soviet soldiers were within grenade range of German positions, German artillery and air support could not fire without killing German soldiers. The tactic was called hugging the enemy, and it stripped the Wehrmacht of its greatest advantages: combined arms coordination, air supremacy over the battle zone, by making those advantages geometrically impossible to apply. The fighting inside Stalingrad was unlike anything either army had experienced. Men fought for individual rooms, for staircases, for the rubble between two destroyed walls. Key positions changed hands 10, 12, 15 times in a single day. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad as a reinforcement was measured in hours. The city's factories, the Red October steel plant, the Barricades gun factory, the tractor factory in the north, became battlefields in which production and combat occupied the same buildings simultaneously. Workers assembled or repaired equipment on one floor while fighting continued on the floor above. Chuikov's men crossed the Volga at night under fire in small groups, because the eastern bank was where the reserves and supplies came from, and the river itself was the last line behind which there was nothing left to hold. Stalin's response to the pressure on Stalingrad was the same as his response to every crisis: hold, at whatever cost, and shoot those who did not. The city could not fall because the city carried his name, and a city carrying his name falling to Hitler would be a psychological catastrophe the Soviet state might not survive. That calculation was not strategic in the military sense. It was political, personal, and, in its consequences, correct. The defense of Stalingrad absorbed and destroyed the combat power of the German Sixth Army through attrition so severe that the army's strength was being consumed faster than it could be replaced. By November, Paulus controlled roughly 90% of the city. His army was also effectively immobilized, bled dry by weeks of close quarters fighting in terrain that offered no opportunity for the maneuver it was trained to execute. While Chuikov held the ruins on the Volga, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky were constructing something else entirely. Through the autumn of 1942, in conditions of strict operational security, The Soviet command assembled a massive reserve force on the steppes north and south of Stalingrad. The plan was not to reinforce the battle in the city. The plan was to leave Chuykov's army as bait, keeping just enough men and ammunition flowing across the Volga to prevent Paulus from finishing the job, while building a force capable of ending the campaign in the south on Soviet terms. The Sixth Army's flanks were held not by German formations, but by Romanian and Hungarian divisions, lightly equipped and stretched across enormous frontages. Zhukov had looked at those flanks and understood what they meant. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 in the morning, Soviet artillery opened fire on the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Then the tanks came. Operation Uranus struck the Romanian formations with forces they had no capacity to resist. The Romanians broke almost immediately, and Soviet armored columns drove through the gaps at speeds the German command did not immediately process as the existential threat they were. A second Soviet attack struck the Romanian Fourth Army south of the city on November 20th. The two pincers moved toward each other across the steppe. On November 23rd, they met at the town of Kalash, 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was closed. Inside, it were approximately 290,000 Axis troops. The geometry of Stalingrad had inverted overnight. The army that had spent 3 months besieging a city was now itself besieged. Paulus's generals urged an immediate breakout to the west while the encirclement was still thin and German armor retained some fuel and operational capacity. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position, to constitute itself as a Festung, a fortress, and to await relief from outside. He told Paulus that the Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air. His aviation chief, Hermann Göring, assured him it was possible. Göring's assurance was either a lie or a delusion. And the Sixth Army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day to function. The Luftwaffe, flying through winter weather with inadequate aircraft in insufficient numbers, managed on its best days to deliver a fraction of that. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army starved. Rations shrank week by week through December and into January. The wounded accumulated faster than they could be evacuated on the return flights of the supply aircraft. Horses were slaughtered for food when rations ran out, and then there were no horses left. Men burned their furniture for warmth and then burned the structural timbers of the buildings they sheltered in. Extreme frostbite inflicted permanent physical ruin without combat. The temperature dropped to -30 and lower. Paulus reported the situation to Hitler's headquarters in cables of increasing desperation, each one carefully describing the impossibility of the position. Hitler's responses were consistent. Hold, no retreat, relief is coming. History will judge those who stand firm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in December, a relief thrust from the southwest aimed at punching a corridor through to the encircled army. Manstein's forces got within 30 miles of the pocket before Soviet counterattacks halted them. The gap between the relief force and Paulus's outermost positions was 30 miles of frozen steppe held by Soviet formations that had grown stronger as Manstein's force grew weaker. A breakout by the Sixth Army might have closed that gap. If Paulus had fuel, if his men were in condition to fight their way out, if Hitler had authorized the attempt, none of those conditions existed simultaneously. By Christmas 1942, Winter Storm had failed. The pocket was permanent. The Soviet command launched Operation Ring on January 10, 1943, the systematic reduction of what remained of the Sixth Army. Soviet artillery compressed the pocket inward, sector by sector. German positions that had been held for weeks collapsed within hours under bombardment, not because the men defending them stopped fighting, but because the men defending them were too weak from starvation and cold to resist. Paulus sent increasingly urgent requests for permission to surrender. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on January 30th, and the same day Soviet forces entered his headquarters. the implicit message being that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and Paulus should draw the appropriate conclusion. Paulus surrendered the next morning. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance inside Stalingrad ended. Approximately 90,000 Axis soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, everything that remained of what had been the finest army in the German order of battle. Among the prisoners were 24 generals. Of the roughly 90,000 men who walked into the camps, fewer than 6,000 would return to Germany after the war. The remainder died in captivity from the same causes: starvation, cold, disease, that had killed the Soviet prisoners Germany had taken in 1941. The symmetry was not accidental. It was the war. And the strategic consequences of Stalingrad spread immediately beyond the city. German Army Group A, which had driven deep into the Caucasus toward the oil fields, was now in danger of being cut off from the rest of the front. It withdrew hastily in January 1943, abandoning the gains of the previous summer. The entire German position in southern Russia had to be reconstructed under pressure. Manstein conducted a brilliant operational recovery in the following weeks, stabilizing the front at Kharkov and preventing a complete collapse. But the resources consumed in doing so were resources Germany could not regenerate. The initiative on the Eastern Front had shifted. Everyone on both sides knew it. What made Stalingrad the hinge was not the tactical drama of the city fighting, nor even the encirclement itself. Encirclements of comparable scale had happened before, and the side that suffered them had survived. What made Stalingrad decisive was what it revealed about the relative trajectories of the two armies. The Soviet command had planned and executed an operation of genuine strategic sophistication, assembling forces in secret, identifying the operational weakness in the German line, and striking it at a moment calibrated to maximum effect. The Red Army that had been routed in 1941 had, by the end of 1942, learned enough to defeat the Wehrmacht at its own game. That was the fact the battle made undeniable. In Germany, Stalingrad was announced to the public on February 3, 1943. Joseph Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. For the first time in the war, the regime acknowledged a defeat, not a setback, not a tactical withdrawal, but a defeat, with the Sixth Army described as having fought to the last man in the service of Germany's future. The reality, which the regime could not acknowledge, was that the last man had surrendered and was now sitting in a Soviet camp eating the same insufficient rations the Soviet state provided for its own prisoners. The gap between the official narrative and the lived experience of the German public was not new in 1943. It was, however, wider than it had ever been before. Hitler's response to Stalingrad was to tighten his personal control over military operations. The commanders who had argued against the decisions that produced the disaster were sidelined or dismissed. Hitler increasingly substituted his own certainty for his general's professional judgment, and a process that had begun in 1941 and accelerated with each subsequent failure. The German army remained a formidable fighting force. It would demonstrate that at Kursk and in the retreating battles of 1943 and 1944. But it was no longer fighting a war it could win. The decisions being made at its apex were no longer correctable by operational excellence at the front. For the Soviet soldier, Stalingrad meant something different. It meant the war had changed direction. The Red Army had been retreating and absorbing catastrophe for 18 months. The men who had survived 1941 and 1942 carried with them the specific and unshakable knowledge of what those months had cost. The encirclements they had walked out of or been captured in, the retreats through burning villages, the commissar's orders to hold positions that were already gone. Then Stalingrad did not erase that knowledge. It put something alongside it, the knowledge that the Wehrmacht could be encircled, that its flanks could be cut, that its army could be destroyed. That knowledge changed what was possible in the minds of the men who had to do what came next. The city of Stalingrad was unrecognizable by February 1943. Virtually nothing above ground was intact. The Volga was choked with the debris of the battle. The civilian population that had not been evacuated before the fighting began had lived through 5 months of conditions that resist ordinary description: starvation, continuous bombardment, the proximity of the fighting to every shelter they could find. The survivors emerged into a city that no longer existed as a city. Reconstruction would take years. The battle for it had taken 5 months and produced, at a conservative estimate, nearly 2 million casualties on both sides. It was the deadliest battle in human history. It was also, in the specific and terrible sense that matters most, the one that decided the war. The hinge had turned. Everything after Stalingrad was a question of how long, how far, and at what further cost. The answers to all 3 of those questions were longer than anyone wanted, farther than anyone had planned, and at a cost that makes the word catastrophic feel inadequate. But the direction was now fixed. The Soviet Union had stopped retreating. The German army had stopped advancing. From the ruins of a city on the Volga in the depths of a Russian winter, the last 2 years of the Eastern Front began. You are a German soldier in the pocket on January 28th. Now, 1943. You have not eaten a full meal in 6 weeks. Your boots are stuffed with newspapers because the leather cracked in the cold, and there is nothing to replace them with. The man beside you in the basement has been dead for 2 days, but you have not moved him because the dead do not require food. You received a radio message this morning from Hitler's headquarters. It said that Germany was proud of you. You put the message down and looked at the wall. Outside, the artillery was moving closer. Wars are decided in factories before they are decided on battlefields. The men who understand this earliest win. The men who understand it latest lose everything. Hitler's planners had understood the industrial dimension of the Eastern War well enough to calculate that the Soviet Union would collapse before its industrial base mattered. They were correct that the first blow would be devastating. They were wrong about the collapse. And because they were wrong about the collapse, they had placed themselves in a contest of industrial production with an adversary whose command economy was specifically designed to outproduce any alternative system under conditions of total mobilization. The contest was not close. By 1943, the Soviet Union was producing more tanks and artillery than Germany. By 1944, it was not a comparison worth making. The Western territories the German army occupied in 1941 contained 85% of Soviet aircraft production, 9 tank factories, 70% of the country's coal mines, half its steel capacity, and 40% of its electricity generation. And the loss of this infrastructure in the first months of the invasion should have been fatal. It was not, for a reason that German planning had not adequately considered. The Soviet state had already spent a decade preparing to move its industrial base east of the Urals if necessary, not because it had foreseen Barbarossa specifically, but because the 5-year plans had deliberately seeded heavy industry in the Urals and Siberia as a strategic reserve the West could never reach. The decision had cost millions in misallocated resources and forced labor. On the night of June 22, 1941, it was the decision that saved the Soviet Union. The evacuation began within days of the invasion. An evacuation council was established on June 24th, 48 hours after the first German shell crossed the border, with authority to commandeer rolling stock, allocate rail capacity, and direct enterprises to specific receiving sites in the east. What followed over the next 5 months was one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in the history of industrial civilization. From July through November 1941, 1,523 large enterprises were dismantled, loaded onto railway flat cars, and moved east. 667 to the Urals, 224 to Western Siberia, 78 to Eastern Siberia, 308 to Central Asia and Kazakhstan, 226 to the Volga region. In total, more than 2,500 industrial enterprises relocated, and along with approximately 12 million workers and their families. The machinery moved under conditions that had no peacetime parallel. Entire steel works were loaded in sequence, furnaces first, then the supporting infrastructure, onto trains that moved east as German bombers targeted the rail lines behind them. Factories that had taken years to build were dismantled in days and loaded imperfectly because there was no time for precision. Equipment arrived at its destination site before the buildings to house it existed. Workers assembled machines in the open, in winter, often with inadequate tools, while construction teams built walls and roofs around them. At the Ural tank factory in Nizhny Tagil, the first T-34 rolled off the reassembled Kharkov production line in December 1941, so 3 months after the factory had been ordered to move. The workers had lived in tents while it was rebuilt. You are the director of the Chelyabinsk tractor factory in the winter of 1941. Your facility has been merged with the evacuated Kirov tank factory from Leningrad and the Kharkov factory from Ukraine. You have 60,000 workers on your premises. A third of them arrived in the last 2 months. Many of them do not have housing. Some sleep on benches inside the factory because the temperatures outside will kill a person who spends the night in the open. The factory's output target for T-34 tanks has been set by Moscow. You will meet it, or you will not be in this position. You have never produced tanks at this scale before. You have never produced tanks at all. You begin. The city of Chelyabinsk in the southern Urals, it became the largest tank production center in the history of warfare. The workers called it Tankigrad, Tank City. The factory complex produced more tanks than the entire German Reich across the war years, in a city that had been a provincial manufacturing center before 1941. This was not an achievement of technological sophistication. It was an achievement of scale, organization, and the kind of coercive mobilization that the Soviet state had been practicing since 1928. The command economy could not produce efficiently. It could produce enormously. In the specific circumstances of the Eastern Front, where the decisive factor was not the quality of each tank, but the number of tanks that could be replaced after each battle, enormous was what was required. But the T-34 was the instrument through which that industrial logic expressed itself on the battlefield. It was not the best tank of the war by any technical measure. The German Panther and Tiger could destroy it at ranges at which it could not effectively reply. But the T-34 could be produced in quantities that made individual tank quality irrelevant as a strategic variable. In 1941, the Soviet Union built approximately 6,000 T-34s. In 1942, it built nearly 12,000. In 1943, it built more T-34s than Germany produced tanks of all models combined, and the T-34 sent to the front in 1943 was cheaper and faster to build than the T-34 sent in 1941. The cost per unit had fallen by more than half, and the production time had been cut by the same proportion. Soviet engineers simplified the design under fire, removing any component that was not essential to making the vehicle function and fight. The workers who produced this output were not the pre-war workforce of male industrial laborers. By 1943, women constituted more than half the factory workforce across Soviet heavy industry. Adolescents, boys of 14 and 15 who had not completed schooling, operated lathes and milling machines on 12-hour shifts. The elderly and the disabled filled roles the pre-war system would never have considered. The training time for an industrial worker had been compressed from months to weeks. The quality of the output suffered in ways that experienced factory directors understood and reported to Moscow, and that Moscow acknowledged by raising the output targets. Quantity was the objective. Perfection was a pre-war luxury. German industrial production followed a different logic, and the difference was decisive. German armaments manufacturing remained partially on a peacetime footing through 1941 and into 1942. Consumer goods production continued, Working hours were not radically extended, women were not mobilized into industry at Soviet rates. Albert Speer, appointed as armaments minister in February 1942, began the process of total war mobilization that the Soviet Union had effectively imposed in June 1941. By the time German production reached its wartime peak in 1944, Allied strategic bombing had begun to constrain it, reducing tank output by roughly 10% in 1943 and 40% in 1944. Germany was attempting to maximize production precisely as the conditions for production were being systematically degraded. The Soviet Union had done its maximizing 2 years earlier. The Lend-Lease program, the American supply of war material to the Soviet Union under a framework of deferred payment, entered the Eastern War as a genuine factor from late 1942 onward, when the supply chains matured. Its contribution was real, carefully targeted, and almost entirely misrepresented in post-war Soviet official history, which minimized it for ideological reasons, and in Western commentary, which has sometimes overstated it for its own reasons. The honest account is more specific than either version. What Lend-Lease supplied most critically was not tanks or aircraft, though it supplied both. The Soviet Union received approximately 14,000 American aircraft, 13,000 tanks, and over 400,000 vehicles through the program. Those numbers were significant. They were not, in themselves, decisive. What Lend-Lease supplied that the Soviet economy genuinely could not produce in sufficient quantity was the infrastructure of mobile warfare: trucks, jeeps, locomotives, and the communications equipment that connected fast-moving formations across a front of hundreds of miles. By the end of the war, roughly a third of all Red Army vehicles had been supplied by America. The Katyusha rocket launcher, one of the most effective Soviet weapons of the war, was typically mounted on the chassis of an American Studebaker truck. The Soviet rail system was also sustained by Lend-Lease in ways that made every other element of the war economy function. Yet nearly 2,000 American locomotives and more than 11,000 railway wagons reached the Soviet Union through the program. Without them, the movement of troops, tanks, artillery, and ammunition from the factories in the Urals to the front lines in Ukraine and Belorussia would have been dramatically slower, and in some periods probably insufficient for the offensive operations the Soviet command was planning. Nikita Khrushchev said after the war that without Lend-Lease trucks and equipment, the Soviet offensive mobility of 1944 and 1945 would have been impossible. Stalin told Roosevelt privately, though not publicly, that the Soviet Union could not have won without it. The honest position on Lend-Lease is that it did not save the Soviet Union. That had been accomplished at catastrophic cost and before American supply arrived in significant volume, but it accelerated the Soviet capacity to go from survival to offensive dominance. The difference between winning in 1945 and winning in 1947 or 1948, if winning at all at that point, is the space in which American material operated. The food alone, 4.5 million tons of canned meat, sugar, flour, and fats, fed divisions that would otherwise have eaten less and fought worse. 15 million pairs of American boots walked across the Soviet Union's Western Front. These are not glamorous contributions. They are the kind that decide wars. The Soviet aircraft program illustrated the industrial war's logic at its most compressed. The T-34's counterpart in the air was the Ilyushin IL-2 ground attack aircraft, the Sturmovik, built in greater numbers than any other military aircraft in history. More than 36,000 were produced across the war. The aircraft was optimized for a single function: destroying German armored formations at low altitude in close support of Soviet ground forces. It was heavily armored on the lower fuselage and cockpit, making it resistant to ground fire from below, and it carried a combination of cannon, bombs, and rockets that made it lethal against tanks. German tank crews called it the Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. Like the T-34, it was not the finest aircraft in the war. It was the most numerous. It was everywhere. and it was being replaced faster than it was being shot down. What the Soviet industrial system accomplished between 1941 and 1945 was genuinely without precedent in the history of warfare. In the second half of 1941 alone, while the largest invasion in history was consuming the western third of the country, Soviet industrial output fell by half. By 1942, the relocated factories were coming back online, and output began recovering. By 1943, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in every major category of war material. This recovery from conditions of near-total industrial catastrophe over a period of roughly 18 months under the direction of a command economy operating through terror and coercion is the central industrial fact of the Second World War. It is not discussed in Western accounts of the conflict with anything approaching the seriousness it deserves. The men and women who made this possible lived in conditions that were themselves forms of extended emergency. Housing in the evacuation cities was insufficient for the populations that arrived. Workers in Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil and Sverdlovsk lived in dormitories, in unheated barracks, in the factories themselves. Rations were calibrated to output. The harder you worked, the more food you received, which meant that not working hard enough was literally a way of starving. The 12-hour shift was the standard. 18-hour shifts were not unusual when production targets required them. Children worked alongside adults because the adults were at the front. Old men worked because there was no one else. The factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 4 years. The lights never went out in Stalingrad. The German army that had crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941 with 3,000 tanks faced a Soviet army by 1944 that could deploy 10,000 in a single operation. The Wehrmacht, that had outproduced and outfought every opponent it encountered in Western Europe, found itself, from 1943 onward, in a war of material attrition it had neither planned for nor possessed the industrial base to survive. It had superior tanks, superior crew training, superior tactical doctrine at the unit level. None of those advantages could compensate for the ratio. A Panther that was tactically superior to 3 T-34s was still, in the arithmetic of the Eastern Front, facing 3 T-34s. The German tank that was destroyed in battle could be replaced at perhaps 1 tank per German tank lost. The Soviet tank that was destroyed could be replaced at 2 or 3. The mathematics ran in one direction. They ran that way for 2 years. The industrial war was the war that the Soviet Union had been building toward, without knowing it, since the first 5-year plan. Stalin had extracted from his population, through forced collectivization and gulag labor and systematic coercion, the capital to build the factories in the Urals that survived the German advance. He had built a command economy that could redirect resources instantaneously, because there were no markets to consult, no shareholders to satisfy, no consumer preferences to accommodate. In a war economy, these are not limitations, they are advantages. The Soviet state had been a war economy before the war began. When the war came, it already knew how to do what the war required. The price it had charged its people for that readiness was enormous. In 1943 and 1944, it began to collect on the bill. After Stalingrad, the German army needed a victory. Not a tactical success on a small section of the front, not a skillful defensive action, but a genuine strategic victory that would demonstrate the Wehrmacht still held the initiative in the east, and that the loss of the Sixth Army had been a catastrophe that the German war machine could absorb and move beyond. Hitler found his opportunity in the shape of the front line itself. The Soviet winter offensives of early 1943 had driven the front westward at great speed and then overreached, allowing Manstein to strike back and retake Kharkov in March. When the spring thaw settled the lines, a massive Soviet salient protruded westward around the city of Kursk, a bulge nearly 200 miles from north to south, surrounded on 3 sides by German-held territory. Hitler looked at it and saw an encirclement waiting to happen. The plan for Operation Citadel, the German assault on the Kursk salient, was straightforward in its geometry. Two army groups would strike simultaneously from north and south, their armored spearheads driving through the salient's neck to meet east of Kursk and trap everything inside. It was precisely the maneuver that had destroyed Soviet armies at Minsk, at Kiev, at Bryansk, and Vyazma. The problem was that the Soviet command knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning at multiple levels, but including through the British intelligence network that was passing intercepts from German Enigma communications. The Soviets had months of warning. They used every day of it. The defensive preparation around Kursk was unlike anything the war had produced. The Soviet command built 8 successive defensive belts extending 300 kilometers in depth, minefields layered at densities of more than 2,000 mines per kilometer of front, anti-tank ditches, artillery fire zones, hardened gun positions designed to channel attacking armor into killing grounds. Over 1 million mines were laid. More than 1.5 million Soviet troops occupied the salient, with a massive strategic reserve, the steppe front, held back beyond the salient's eastern edge, and ready to be committed once the German attack had exhausted itself against the defenses. For the first time, the Soviet command planned to let the Germans attack, absorb the blow without breaking, and then counterattack from strength rather than desperation. German preparations took longer than the plan originally allowed. Hitler delayed the assault twice, waiting for new tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, to arrive in sufficient numbers to give the attack the armored weight he believed it required. Each delay gave the Soviet defenders more time to dig, mine, and reinforce. By the time Operation Citadel finally launched on July 5, 1943, the German assault was heading into the most fortified position in the history of warfare. And the Soviets knew the exact date and time it would begin from intelligence that reached Moscow the night before the attack opened. The fighting at Kursk did not look like the great sweeping encirclements of 1941. It looked like mass murder at close range. German armor drove forward into successive layers of defense that slowed and ground each attack into the one behind it. For every belt that was breached, another waited beyond it. Soviet anti-tank guns, positioned to fire from the flanks rather than head-on, targeting the vulnerable sides of even the heaviest German tanks, methodically destroyed the spearheads. The Panther, arriving in large numbers at Kursk for the first time, proved mechanically unreliable and burned at a rate that shocked its designers. By the 7th day of the assault in the north, the German advance had penetrated 9 miles into a salient that was nearly 70 miles deep. It was not going to close. At Prokhorovka, on July 12th, the armored forces of the SS Panzer Corps clashed with the Soviet Fifth Guards tank army in the engagement that has passed into history as the largest single-tank battle ever fought. Hundreds of tanks fought at ranges so close that the superiority of German gun and armor was often neutralized by proximity. A Tiger could not use its long-range advantage if a T-34 was 40 yards away. The fighting lasted most of the day. Soviet tank losses were higher. The Germans did not advance. That evening, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel. News had arrived that the Western Allies had landed in Sicily. He needed reserves in the west. He pulled them from Kursk. The German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front ended on July 13, 1943, and it never resumed. What happened next was what Zhukov and Vasilevsky had planned while the German attack was still burning itself out against the Kursk defenses. The Soviet counteroffensive opened on July 12th in the north and extended south through August. Operation Kutuzov struck the German forces around Orel. Operation Rumyantsev drove into the German positions south of Kursk. Kharkov, taken back by Manstein in March, lost again by August, fell for the final time on August 23, 1943. The front was moving west, and it would not stop moving west for the remaining 22 months of the war. Every strategic offensive from this point forward belonged to the Soviet Union. The doctrine that made the Soviet offensives of 1943 to 1945 work had a name: Glubokaya Operatsiya, deep battle or deep operations. It had been developed in the 1930s by Soviet military theorists, suppressed during the purges when the men who wrote it were arrested and shot, and then rediscovered through catastrophe when the failures of 1941 made the need for a better operational framework undeniable. Deep battle held that the correct way to defeat a modern army was not to attack it at one point and push it back, but to attack it simultaneously at multiple points along the entire depth of its defensive position, preventing it from shifting reserves to threatened sectors and causing its front to collapse rather than bend. The idea was not new. What was new was the scale at which the Soviet army by 1943 could execute it. The instrument of deep battle was the tank army, a formation of 50,000 men and over 800 tanks, capable of punching through a tactical breach created by infantry and artillery and then driving deep into the German rear before the defenders could respond. By 1944, the Soviet command had 6 such armies. They had learned to coordinate multiple tank armies across fronts of hundreds of miles, sequencing attacks so that a German formation moved to seal one breach found a new one opening behind it. The Wehrmacht had invented this kind of warfare. By 1944, it was facing a larger and more logistically capable version of it, directed by commanders who had learned their operational art through 2 years of catastrophic failure, and were now applying it with a precision that the Germans, stretched thin across a front that was contracting with every passing month, could not adequately counter. Maskirovka, military deception, was the enabler that made the tempo of Soviet offensives possible. The Soviet command became, from 1943 onward, systematically expert at concealing the location, size, and timing of its major operations. Entire armies moved at night, under strict radio silence, using routes that avoided observation from German air reconnaissance. Dummy tanks, dummy gun positions, and false radio traffic convinced German intelligence that Soviet forces were concentrating at points they were not concentrating at. Before Operation Bagration in June 1944, German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength in the Belarusian sector at roughly 1,500 vehicles. The actual figure was over 5,000. And the Wehrmacht positioned its mobile reserves in the south, where Soviet deception operations indicated the blow would fall. The blow fell in the center. Operation Bagration opened on June 22, 1944, the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion, a date the Soviet command chose with a deliberateness that carried its own message. 2.25 million Soviet troops attacked along a 700-kilometer front in Belorussia. The German Army Group Center, the formation that had swept through Minsk and Smolensk and reached the outskirts of Moscow in 1941, was the target. It held 34 divisions. 28 of those divisions were destroyed in a campaign lasting less than 2 months. The Red Army advanced 600 kilometers in 6 weeks, liberated Minsk on July 3rd, and reached the Vistula River in Poland by August. The operation was the largest defeat in the history of the German army. It happened the same summer as D-Day, and almost no one outside the Soviet Union has heard of it. The Western Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. By the end of August, they had broken out of the beachhead and were advancing toward Paris. The campaign in France was fought by roughly 1.5 million Allied troops against German forces that were being systematically stripped of their best formations to send east, where the Red Army was consuming divisions faster than Germany could replace them. The relationship between the two fronts was not one of equivalence. It was one of cause and effect. The Western Front was possible at the scale it occurred because the Eastern Front had already absorbed the majority of Germany's combat power. The 6 divisions that did not reinforce Normandy because they were fighting at Kursk or retreating through Belorussia were the divisions the Atlantic Wall was supposed to be defending with. The pace of Soviet operational learning between 1941 and 1944 is almost impossible to overstate. The army that had been routed in the opening days of Barbarossa, that had lost 600,000 men at Kiev, that had collapsed at Bryansk and Vyazma in October 1941, had by 1944 become the most capable large-scale offensive force in the world. It had learned combined arms coordination, tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft, working in sequence rather than in isolation. It had learned logistics management at operational scale. That's the critical competence that makes the difference between an army that breaks through and one that breaks through and then stalls for lack of fuel and ammunition. It had learned to rotate formations in and out of contact so that the army hitting the German line in week 4 of an offensive was not the same depleted army that had opened it. These were not simple lessons. They were paid for in blood. The Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945 demonstrated what the Soviet army had become. On January 12th, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front launched from their Vistula bridgeheads with over 2 million men, 7,000 tanks, and 46,000 artillery pieces. The German forces in their path were outnumbered 5-1 in troops and 7-1 in armor. The front did not bend. Thus it dissolved. Within 2 weeks, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 500 kilometers, liberated Warsaw, and crossed into the pre-war borders of the German Reich itself. By early February, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, 60 kilometers from Berlin. In 14 days, it had covered more ground than the Western Allies covered in 3 months of fighting from Normandy. Hitler's response to the collapse in the East was the same response he had applied to every previous collapse: hold. Fortress cities were designated: Breslau, Königsberg, Poznan, and their garrisons ordered to fight to the last man, tying down Soviet forces that would otherwise have driven straight for Berlin. Some of these garrisons held for weeks, some for months, consuming enormous Soviet resources and German lives in sieges that served no strategic purpose beyond the delay they imposed. The populations trapped inside them, German civilians who had not fled as the Soviet advance came, endured the consequences of a command structure that had decided that the deaths of its own people were an acceptable instrument of policy. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945, when Soviet artillery opened fire on German positions east of the city. The bombardment involved more than 40,000 guns and mortars firing simultaneously. The sound was audible for hundreds of miles. 3 Soviet fronts under Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky converged on the capital from east, south, and north, totaling over 2.5 million men. The city was defended by a mixture of exhausted regular formations, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm militia, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth, handed rifles in the last weeks of the Reich's existence. Hitler was in his bunker beneath the Reichschancellery. He had been there since January. He would not leave. The fighting in Berlin replicated at a larger and grimmer scale the logic of Stalingrad in reverse. Soviet soldiers pushed through rubble and sewers and collapsed buildings, house by house, room by room, while German defenders, some of them willing, some of them simply unable to surrender because they had nowhere to go, used the same terrain to slow an advance they could not stop. The Reichstag was reached on April 30th. Soviet soldiers hoisted a red flag from its roof. In his bunker nearby, Hitler took his own life. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Soviet soldier who had survived the entire war, from the border collapse in June 1941 to the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, had crossed nearly 2,000 miles of territory in both directions, east and west, under conditions of violence and privation that most human beings do not approach in a lifetime. He had watched men beside him die in numbers his government did not fully disclose for decades. He had been threatened by his own army's blocking detachments, supervised by commissars, and operated under a system that treated his life as a resource to be spent efficiently. He had fought through the worst military disaster in Russian history and through the greatest reversal of military fortune the modern world had seen. He had, on the day of victory, almost certainly lost people he would mourn for the rest of his life. The Soviet state would call what he had done heroic. The word is not wrong. It is also not adequate. The arc from Kursk to Berlin lasted 22 months. It covered at its widest a front of more than 2,000 miles. It consumed armies at a rate that modern military planning has no framework to accommodate. It was directed by commanders who had learned their trade through catastrophic failure and applied what they had learned with increasing skill and confidence against an opponent that was capable, professional, and running out of everything. The Red Army did not win because it was better in any conventional military sense. It won because it was bigger, because it was getting better faster than Germany was getting worse, and because the system behind it, brutal, coercive, and ideologically driven, had built the industrial and human capacity to sustain losses that would have ended any other country's ability to fight. That is the story of the Eastern Front. Everything else is geography. On the morning of May 9th, 1945, a day the Soviet Union called Victory Day and still does, a Red Army soldier somewhere in the ruins of Berlin understood that the war was over. What he felt at that moment is not recorded. The men who wrote the histories wrote about strategy and operations and turning points. The men who were there mostly did not write about it at all. The silence is its own testimony. It lasted a long time, and it was very heavy, and the people who carried it took most of it to their graves. The war ended on May 8th, 1945, in Europe. The Soviet Union had been fighting for 3 years, 10 months, and in 17 days. In that time, it had absorbed the largest military invasion in history, lost more territory, more soldiers, and more civilians than any country in any war ever recorded, reconstituted its army from the ruins of catastrophic defeat, rebuilt its industrial base on the far side of a mountain range while the enemy occupied the cities where that base had been, and then driven that enemy from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of his capital. The cost of doing this was approximately 27 million Soviet lives, military dead 8.7 million, civilian dead 19 million. 1 in every 7 people living in the Soviet Union in June 1941 was dead by May 1945. A quarter of the population had been wounded or killed. The number 27 million is not a fact that can be absorbed. It can only be held at arm's length and examined for what it implies. More Soviet citizens died in the war than the entire pre-war population of Australia. More Soviet citizens died than all military deaths in the First World War combined, on all sides, in all theaters. The Soviet Union's losses exceeded the combined military and civilian casualties of the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. They exceeded by a factor of roughly 18 the total American deaths in the Second World War. These are not statistics designed to diminish other losses. They are the scale of what happened, stated plainly, and they require a different framework than the one most people in the English-speaking world apply to the Second World War. The men who died were not distributed evenly across age or region. The Soviet men between the ages of 24 and 35 in 1941 had on average a 39% chance of dying in the war. In some regions, in some cohorts, the survival rates were lower than that. The villages of Belorussia and Ukraine lost proportions of their male populations that left the demographic structure of those places altered for generations. Women who had been 30 in 1941 and survived the war emerged into a society in which men their age were an absence rather than a presence. They raised children alone, worked collective farm machinery alone, and buried their dead in cemeteries that in some villages contained more names than the village itself had living inhabitants by the time the war ended. The Gulag did not close when the war ended. It expanded. Stalin, in the years immediately after victory, to return to the methods he had used in the 1930s: purges, arrests, show trials, the systematic elimination of anyone he perceived as a potential rival or a focus of loyalty outside the party. The veterans who came home from the front carried with them an authority and a directness of experience that the regime found threatening. Soldiers who had spent 4 years executing their own judgment under fire, who had seen what the world looked like outside the Soviet Union, who had friendships and loyalties built in the crucible of combat rather than assigned by the party. These men were dangerous in ways that the regime understood, even if it could not fully articulate them. Some were arrested. Some were sent to camps. The ones who had been prisoners of war and survived German captivity were, in many cases, investigated for collaboration and stripped of veteran status. The state that had sent them to fight treated their return as a security problem. The official Soviet death toll, when Stalin finally acknowledged it publicly in the late 1940s, was 7 million. The true figure was nearly 4 times that. The gap between those numbers was not an accounting error. It was a political decision. A country whose leader had misread the German threat, failed to prepare his army adequately, collapsed for a week after the invasion began, and then spent 4 years spending human lives at a rate that no other government in the war had matched. That country needed a narrative of heroism more than it needed an accurate body count. The 27 million became publicly acknowledged only decades later under subsequent governments, and the full moral weight of the methods by which the victory was achieved has never been formally reckoned with by any Russian government. The question of whether the Soviet Union could have won the war with fewer dead is one that historians have argued about for decades without resolution, because it depends on counterfactuals that cannot be tested. What can be stated is that the specific form of the Soviet state, its willingness to spend soldiers faster than any professional military doctrine would sanction, its capacity to extract resources from its population at rates no democratic government could have survived, its ability to treat human life as a subordinate variable in an industrial optimization problem, was not incidental to the victory. It was the mechanism of the victory. A Soviet Union that had protected its people more carefully would have been a Soviet Union that lost the war. That is the most uncomfortable fact the Eastern Front produces, and it has no satisfying resolution. The Gulag population at the end of the war stood at approximately 1.5 million, down from 2.3 million in 1941 because the camps had killed or released into the army a significant fraction of their pre-war inmates. It began growing again almost immediately. By 1950, it was back above 2.5 million. The forced labor system continued to operate for another decade after the war, building infrastructure, mining resources, and filling the role in the Soviet economy that its designers had always intended it to fill. And the men and women who built the factories in the Urals that produced the tanks that won the war included hundreds of thousands of Gulag prisoners. The victory and the atrocity were not separate achievements. They were, in the most literal material sense, the same project. What the Western world has made of all this is, in its own way, a significant historical fact. A poll conducted in 2015 found that 11% of Americans, 15% of British citizens, and 15% of French citizens believed the Soviet Union had contributed most to Germany's defeat in the Second World War. The actual figure, the one that the arithmetic supports without ambiguity, is that the Soviet Union bore the primary military burden of defeating Nazi Germany, absorbed approximately 80% of all German military casualties, and won the decisive battles of the European War before the Western Allies had established a permanent foothold on the continent. The gap between that reality and the public understanding of it in the countries whose cultural products, films, books, television series, museum exhibitions, have shaped how the English-speaking world understands the Second World War is not a small gap. It is a chasm. The reasons for the gap are not mysterious. The Cold War made the Soviet Union an adversary within months of the German surrender, and adversaries are not easily acknowledged as the primary authors of shared victories. Hollywood produced the war's dominant cultural narrative, and Hollywood told American stories about American contributions because that was what American audiences wanted and what American studios could finance. And the British told British stories. The French told French stories. The Soviet Union told its own stories, which were propagandistic in their own ways, and which the West had no reason to accept on their own terms. In the space created by all these competing national narratives, the Eastern Front, where most of the war was actually decided, became a matter for specialists and serious historians rather than public understanding. The victory itself did not belong to Stalin in any straightforward sense, though he claimed it and built his post-war authority partly on that claim. The people who won the war were a conscripted woman on a factory floor in Chelyabinsk and a 19-year-old private crossing the Volga at night into Stalingrad, and a tank commander at Kursk who survived his vehicle being hit twice and climbed back in both times. And the system that organized and directed and coerced their effort was Stalin's. The effort itself, the human endurance that the system extracted from people who had no alternative, belonged to the people who provided it. The distinction matters morally, even if it is invisible politically. The Soviet state claimed the victory as its own. It was, in the most intimate sense, the people's victory, paid for by the people at a price the state set and collected without their consent. The physical landscape of the Western Soviet Union in 1945 was a record of what the war had cost. 1,700 cities and towns had been completely or partially destroyed. 70,000 villages had been burned. 32,000 industrial establishments had been wrecked or dismantled, and 64,000 kilometers of railway had been torn up or bombed into uselessness. The reconstruction that followed took a generation and was never fully complete in the places that had been occupied longest. Belorussia had lost approximately a quarter of its entire pre-war population. The land itself bore the marks of the war for decades. Unexploded ordnance, mass graves found during construction projects, the outlines of fortifications visible from the air long after the men who dug them were dead. Germany's post-war reckoning with the Eastern Front followed a specific and revealing pattern. West Germany, integrated into the Western alliance structure, built its historical understanding of the war largely on the memoir literature of German generals who had served in the East. Accounts that emphasized tactical brilliance, professional military virtue, and the intractable difficulties of Russian geography and winter. The atrocities committed by German forces in the occupied territories, the deliberate starvation of prisoners, the systematic murder of Jewish communities, the hunger plan. These were acknowledged slowly, partially, and often framed as the work of the SS rather than the Wehrmacht. The professional army, in this telling, had fought a hard war cleanly. The historical record, as it has been reconstructed from Soviet archives, opened after 1991, does not support that version. The Wehrmacht was complicit in the atrocities of the Eastern War at every level of command. What Russia made of the war is a separate and ongoing story. The memory of the Great Patriotic War, the name the Soviet Union gave the Eastern conflict, locating it in a tradition of existential national struggle, became the central founding myth of Soviet legitimacy, and then, after the Soviet Union's collapse, the most durable source of Russian national identity available to governments that had discarded everything else the Soviet state had claimed to stand for. Victory Day on May 9th became the most emotionally charged public event in the Russian calendar. The scale of the loss and the scale of the achievement provided a moral capital that no subsequent Russian government has been willing to surrender, and that has proven nearly impossible to separate from the methods by which the victory was achieved. The moral weight of the Eastern Front does not resolve into anything comfortable. The Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany. That was a genuine and necessary achievement. The alternative, a Nazi hegemony over Europe, is a vision of civilizational catastrophe that makes the actual outcome, however terrible, preferable. The methods by which the Soviet Union achieved that outcome, the coercion, the executions, the gulag, the deliberate expenditure of human lives, the system that treated its own people as raw material for a state project, were themselves a sustained atrocity. Holding both of those things simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other, is what honest engagement with the Eastern Front requires. It is also what most national narratives on every side have failed to do. The soldier who came home from the Eastern Front, if he came home, returned to a country that had changed in every dimension during his absence. His village might be gone. The men his age who had not died were often maimed, physically or otherwise, in ways that the Soviet state had no system for treating and that the surrounding culture had no language for acknowledging. Post-traumatic illness existed among Soviet veterans at rates that can only be estimated because the Soviet medical and psychiatric system had no interest in documenting them. The official position was that Soviet soldiers had fought heroically for the Soviet motherland and had won. The space for anything more complicated than that, grief, horror, damage, the specific weight of having survived when everyone around you did not, was not available in the public culture that followed the war. The children born after the war grew up in the shadow of a loss so large that it could not be adequately grieved. Every family in the Western Soviet Union had lost someone. In many families, the loss was not a single person, but a generation. The fathers and uncles and older brothers who were not there, whose absence shaped the family that remained. Soviet culture processed this grief through the language of heroism and sacrifice, which captured something real but omitted everything that heroism and sacrifice cannot hold. The waste, the futility of specific deaths, the men who died because an order was wrong, or a commander was incompetent, or a blocking detachment was there, the men who died not heroically, but simply. Most of the 27 million died simply. The Eastern Front produced more records of every kind: the largest invasion, the longest siege, the largest tank battle, the largest encirclements, the highest prisoner death rates, the largest forced labor mobilization, the largest industrial evacuation, than any other campaign in the history of warfare. It lasted nearly 4 years across a front that was never shorter than 2,000 miles. It consumed at its peak more men, more material, in a more industrial capacity than the rest of the Second World War combined. And it is, in the countries whose language and culture dominate the global understanding of history, the least understood major event of the 20th century. The war the West thinks it knows, D-Day, Churchill, Eisenhower, the liberation of Paris, was a real war fought by real people at real cost. It was also, by the measurements that matter most in assessing military history, a secondary theater of a conflict whose primary dimensions were entirely elsewhere. The men who planned the Normandy landings knew this. Eisenhower acknowledged it. Churchill acknowledged it. The scale of what was happening in the East was not a secret in 1944. It has since become one, not through deliberate suppression, but through the ordinary processes by which national memory simplifies history to fit the stories nations need to tell about themselves. What is left, when you follow the Eastern Front to its end and stand in the ruins of what it cost, is a question that has no clean answer. What does it mean that this happened? Not strategically, not militarily, but humanly. What does it mean that a country built on systematic violence against its own people absorbed and survived and ultimately defeated the most efficient military organization the modern world had produced, and did so by becoming, in some essential dimension, more terrible than the thing it was fighting? The Soviet Union was not the moral equivalent of Nazi Germany. The two systems, whatever their similarities in method, were not equivalent in intention or outcome. But the Soviet Union was not fighting for freedom. It was fighting for survival, and it was willing to do anything to survive. And it did. The men and women of the Eastern Front deserved to be known, not as symbols, not as the abstractions of national narratives, but as people who lived inside a specific and extraordinary and devastating set of circumstances and found ways, through coercion and courage and desperation and belief and the simple animal instinct, to continue existing, to get through it. Most of them are dead now. The last veterans of the Great Patriotic War are in their final years. The documents and memoirs and testimonies they left behind are the closest we can come to what they knew. The Eastern Front was the largest human catastrophe of the 20th century, and its survivors carried it mostly in silence, and the silence is ending, and what replaces it matters enormously, not for the sake of history, but for the sake of what we understand about what human beings are capable of doing to each other and to themselves in the name of something they have decided is worth it.